My name is Claire. To everyone in my social circle, I was the perfect submissive wife, living in a beautiful Manhattan home, content with my quiet life. But they were all dead wrong. While my husband was busy cheating and building his secret empire, I was busy executing a silent 60-day plan to dismantle everything he owned. He thought he was untouchable, but by the time he realized I was the one holding the strings, it was already too late to beg for mercy. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how I destroyed him, piece by piece, without him ever seeing it coming. If you love stories of justice served cold, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. And before we dive into the wreckage, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The reservation was under my name. It was supposed to be our anniversary dinner at Le Bernardin, one of those Manhattan spots where the atmosphere is as crisp as the wine list. I arrived 10 minutes early, intending to set the tone for the night. I didn't expect to find my husband Brad already seated at a corner table. He wasn't alone. Amber, his junior partner at the firm, was leaning in close, her hand resting on his forearm. I stopped walking. I didn't freeze, and I certainly didn't gasp. I simply stood there, observing the scene like a data analyst reviewing a failing market trend. There was no theatrical heartbreak. There was only the sudden, cold realization of a miscalculation. I had invested years into this marriage, believing in a partnership, while Brad had been treating our life as a side project he could abandon whenever a better deal appeared. I walked over to the table. When Brad looked up, his face didn't crumble in guilt. It twisted into the irritated expression of a man caught in a clerical error. "Claire," he said, his voice level, devoid of any genuine panic. "This isn't what it looks like. We were just discussing the quarterly projections." I pulled out the chair across from them and sat down. I didn't bother with a napkin. "The projections don't usually involve intimate dinners on our anniversary, Brad, and they certainly don't involve your hand under the table."
Amber started to sputter, something about a misunderstanding, but I cut her off with a sharp glance. I didn't need to hear the excuses. Excuses are for people who intend to stay. I was already looking for the exit.
"Save the performance," I said, addressing Brad directly. "We both know the truth. You've been distracted for months. I assumed it was the merger, but it was just her." Brad leaned back, his arrogance slowly returning. He assumed I would cause a scene, that I would create a spectacle that would force him to play the role of the apologetic husband. He was wrong. "Look, Claire, let's not make this difficult," he said, his tone condescending. "We have a prenup. It's ironclad. You know that. Any scene you make here only hurts your standing, not mine." He was right about the prenup. It was a restrictive, suffocating document he'd insisted on when he was just an associate. It was designed to protect his assets at the expense of my autonomy. If I walked away now, driven by emotion, I would walk away with pennies, while he kept the house, the accounts, and the career we had built together. I wouldn't get a dime of the equity he'd accumulated because the document demanded clear evidence of fault, and suspected infidelity didn't qualify as a breach. "I'm not making a scene," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm making a decision. You're right about the prenup. It covers everything." I stood up, adjusting my coat. I looked at Amber, who was watching us like a deer caught in headlights, and then back to Brad. "Enjoy your dinner. The check is on me." I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool Manhattan air. My heart wasn't racing. My mind was already parsing through the legalities. Divorce was the only option, but it couldn't be a messy, emotional exit. It had to be a dismantle. I needed leverage. I needed evidence that was so concrete it would shatter that ironclad prenup into dust. Brad wanted to keep his assets? Fine. But he was about to learn that when you treat a marriage like a business, you don't get to complain when the other partner starts looking for a hostile takeover. I pulled out my phone and walked toward the subway. The war hadn't started yet. I had just finished my recon. The real game was about to begin. The 48 hours following the restaurant were not spent mourning. I didn't reach for a bottle of wine, and I didn't call my mother to vent. Instead, I spent the time auditing my own life. I pulled up every joint bank statement, every shared investment, and every digital receipt I had access to. If I wanted to dismantle Brad's world, I had to know exactly how it was built. I needed to identify where the cracks were, and more importantly, where the gold was hidden. I was sitting in my home office, reviewing the tax returns from the previous fiscal year, when an encrypted message pinged on my private device. It wasn't from a client. It was an invitation to a private meeting at a quiet, members-only club in Midtown. The sender was Mark Sterling. I knew the name. He was a high-profile investor who had recently been making headlines for aggressive market acquisitions. I didn't know him personally, but curiosity compelled me. I accepted. The club was dimly lit, designed for people who didn't want to be seen. Mark was waiting in a secluded booth. He wasn't the type to show frustration. He had the same cool, detached demeanor I was trying to cultivate. "Claire," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "you're wondering why I asked you here." "I assume you have a reason," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "I don't waste time on social calls, and I doubt you do either." He nodded once, a gesture of mutual understanding. "I'm married to Amber." The air in the booth shifted. It wasn't shock, but a sudden, crystalline clarity. Of course, it made sense. The timing of their affairs, the sudden shifts in their schedules, it was a coordinated overlap. "I've been monitoring their interactions for months," Mark continued, his voice devoid of anger. "I'm not interested in a messy divorce or a public scandal that tanks my portfolio. I'm interested in results. I have reason to believe Brad is leveraging my company's assets to fund their lifestyle. It's not just an affair, Claire. It's embezzlement on a scale that will put them both away." He slid a leather portfolio across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000 and the contact information for a top-tier forensic litigation firm. "This is operating capital," he explained, "and those lawyers are the best in the state. They will handle your divorce and they will bury Brad, but there is a condition. You cannot file for 60 days. I lean back, processing the implications. 60 days. You want me to play the role of the oblivious wife while you position your assets to survive the fallout? "I want you to be my eyes on the inside," Mark said, his eyes hard. "Brad trusts you because he thinks you're weak. He thinks you're the trophy wife who is too dependent to leave. Maintain that illusion. Give him no reason to suspect you're building a case. In 60 days, we will have the leverage to strip his reputation, his finances, and his career. You get your freedom and a clean financial slate. I get justice for my company." It was a cold, calculated transaction. My heart rate didn't spike. I looked at the check, then at Mark. The offer was a lifeline, but it was also a weapon. If I accepted, I would have to live in a lie for 2 months. I would have to endure Brad's gaslighting, his mother's condescension, and the sickening sight of his infidelity, all while smiling and pouring his morning coffee. 60 days, I repeated, confirming the terms. I need full autonomy on how the evidence is gathered. I don't want your interference once I start the surveillance. "Done?" Mark replied. I took the portfolio. The weight of the check was insignificant compared to the weight of the opportunity. Brad wanted a submissive wife. I would give him the most submissive wife he had ever seen. I would be a ghost in his house, watching, listening, and recording every mistake he made. He thought he was the architect of our future, but he was just building his own prison. "We have a deal," I said, standing up. 60 days starts now. I walked out of the club, the city lights reflecting off the glass windows. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an asset. And for the first time since that night at the restaurant, I felt a sense of calm. The game had shifted from defense to offense,
And for the first time in years, I held all the cards. I hailed a cab, ready to go home and begin the performance of a lifetime.
Entering the house felt like walking onto a stage where I had to play a role I thoroughly despised. My house, a sprawling glass and steel structure in the suburbs, had once felt like a sanctuary. Now, it was just a laboratory for my experiment. Brett was in the living room, nursing a Strutch, looking entirely too comfortable. He didn't even stand up when I walked in. He didn't have to. In his mind, he had already won.
"Glad you're back," he said, not even glancing at me from his phone. "I thought you might need a few days to cool off. You were acting a bit hysterical at dinner." That was his favorite tactic, gaslighting. If he could frame my righteous anger as hysteria, he could invalidate my reality. It was a classic move, and I used to fall for it. Not anymore. I walked over to the bar, poured a glass of water, and forced a soft, defeated expression onto my face. It was a deliberate choice, the armor of the weak.
"I'm sorry, Brad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was tired. The pressure of the anniversary, everything. I overreacted. He looked up then, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. He had expected an argument, a lawyer's letter, or at least a demand for an explanation. He didn't know what to do with compliance. "Apology accepted," he said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Just don't do it again. It's embarrassing for both of us." I nodded, playing the part perfectly. "I won't. I just want things to go back to normal." The real challenge arrived the following weekend. His mother, Linda. She made it her mission to remind me in every conversation that I was a charity case Brad had plucked from obscurity. She walked into the kitchen while I was prepping lunch, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for dust.
"Claire, dear," she started, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I saw the florist van leaving. Did you actually order fresh lilies? Again? You know how wasteful that is. Your budget is already strained as it is."
I looked at her, then down at my hands. "I'll make a note of it, Linda. I'm sorry."
She scoffed, picking up a bowl I had set on the counter. "You really should pay more attention. Brad works so hard to build his empire, and you spend your days playing house. It's a wonder he hasn't moved on sooner."
She thought she was being subtle. She wasn't. She was arrogant, classist, and utterly convinced of their superiority. Every insult she hurled was just another confirmation of why they deserved what was coming. I didn't feel the sting of her words. I felt the cold satisfaction of knowing the clock was ticking.
"You're right, Linda," I said, offering a small, hollow smile. "I should do better. I'll make sure to be more efficient." She smirked, clearly satisfied with her dominance. "Good. It's the least you can do." As she walked out, I stood in the silence of the kitchen. They thought I was weak because I chose not to fight back. They confused my silence with submission. They didn't realize that every time they belittled me, they were lowering their guard just a fraction more. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their perceived power that they didn't notice the atmosphere in the house had changed.
I wasn't living in their reality anymore. I was simply occupying space while my real life, the one where I held all the control, continued to operate in the shadows. I watched them from the periphery, gathering data. Every comment, every transaction, every suspicious call Brad took in the home office was a piece of the puzzle I was assembling. They were digging their own graves. I was just holding the shovel. I needed to move to the next phase, securing physical proof. I knew where to look, and I knew how to record the rot. The mask of the submissive wife was more than just a performance. It was a cloak of invisibility. Because I was just Claire, the person who ordered groceries and managed the house, nobody thought to hide anything in my presence. Brad and his mother, Linda, stopped filtering their conversations when I entered the room. They didn't see me as a threat. They saw me as furniture. That level of negligence was their first fatal mistake. I started digging into the household finances, not through bank statements, but through the digital trail of our smart home hub. Brad, in his arrogance, had integrated every aspect of our lives, finance, security, communication, into one centralized system. He had total control, but he also had total vulnerability. By tapping into the back end of our home's network, I discovered something that turned a divorce case into a criminal investigation.
Linda wasn't just Brett's mother, she was his silent partner. Every month, a consulting fee was wired from a shell company, the same entity Mark had flagged, directly into an account under Linda's maiden name. It was blatant money laundering. She was living off the proceeds of Brett's shady dealings, a luxury lifestyle built on white-collar fraud. She wasn't just a classist snob, she was an accomplice.
Knowing this changed my strategy. I didn't need to break into a safe or find a paper trail. I just needed the audio.
Installing the surveillance took patience. I used the excuse of upgrading the smart home features to call a technician, but I did the actual configuration myself late at night while Brad was out with Amber. I installed digital bugs in the home office and the master study, syncing them to a secure cloud server that only I could access. I was creating a library of their own admissions. The opportunity to test the system arrived on a Tuesday. Brad was in his study, pacing, with Linda sitting on the sofa, sipping tea. I was in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning, but in reality, I was monitoring the audio feed through my tablet.
The regulators are starting to ask questions about the liquidity in the holding firm, Brett said, his voice tense. I need you to move the funds from your account to the offshore trust by Friday. If they trace it back to you, I can't protect you.
Linda didn't sound worried. She sounded bored. It's been fine for 3 years, Brett. Don't be so dramatic. Just bribe the auditor like you did last time. It's a business expense. It's not that simple anymore, Brad snapped. Things are tighter. Just do what I say or the whole thing goes under.
I stood in the kitchen, my hand gripping the counter, listening to the blueprint of their destruction. Every word was gold. They weren't just discussing corporate strategy. They were explicitly detailing embezzlement and obstruction of justice. It was an open and shut case for any competent investigator.
I didn't rush in. I didn't throw the recording in their faces. I remained the woman they thought they knew. A few minutes later, I walked into the study with a tray of tea, projecting the image of the dutiful wife. I thought you both might need a break, I said, setting the tray down gently.
Brad looked at me, his eyes cold and dismissive. We're in the middle of something, Claire. Leave it.
Of course, I said, offering a small, apologetic smile. I'll be in the garden.
I walked out, but I didn't head to the garden. I went to my room and checked the download. The file was saved, encrypted, and backed up in 3 separate locations. I had the smoking gun.
The weight of the house felt different now. It was no longer a cage. It was a museum of their inevitable downfall. They were still planning their future, confident in their invincibility, completely unaware that I was the one holding the remote control to their lives. I didn't need to be angry anymore. I just needed to be precise. The trap was set, and all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. My friend Jen would be the next step in this process. It was time to verify the numbers.
I needed seseorang who could read numbers the way a detective reads a crime scene. I didn't need a lawyer, not yet. I needed a forensic accountant, and thankfully, I had the best one in my contacts, my best friend, Jen. We met at a discreet, windowless co-working space downtown on a Sunday afternoon. No distractions, no chance of being overheard. Jen didn't ask questions about my marriage or the emotional fallout. She knew me well enough to understand that when I reached out like this, it wasn't for a shoulder to cry on. It was for a precision strike.
You said you have the keys to the kingdom? Jen asked, her laptop already open.
I slid a secure flash drive across the table. It contained the raw data I'd scraped from our home network, including the encrypted logs of Brad's server access and the digital trail of his transactions. I have more than keys, Jen. I have the blueprints. I need to know where the money is bleeding.
She plugged the drive in, her fingers flying across the keys with an efficiency that bordered on surgical. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the room was the hum of the ventilation and the rapid-fire clicking of her mouse. I sat back, watching her screen as lines of code and financial records flashed by. I wasn't just observing a friend working. I was watching the construction of Brad's prison cell.
"He's been busy," Jen muttered, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't just skimming off the top. This is systematic looting." She pulled up a series of shell companies, all registered under names that traced back to anonymous offshore entities. "Look at this," she pointed to the screen. "Brad and this Amber partner of his, they've been setting up a secondary ledger. They're funneling capital from the main firm's operating budget into these shells, disguised as consulting fees and tech development costs. It's textbook embezzlement, but on an industrial scale." I leaned in closer. "Is there enough to prove intent?"
More than enough, Jen replied, her tone hardening. They weren't just moving cash, they were engaging in insider trading. They've been dumping shares of the firm just before major project announcements, then buying back in when the stock dipped. It's market manipulation, clear as day.
But the real shock came when she pulled up the lease agreement for a high-end property in downtown Manhattan. It wasn't in Brad's name, or mine. It was leased to a holding company controlled by the same shell firms they used for the embezzlement.
A secret penthouse, I whispered, the realization settling in.
High-end, top floor, fully furnished, and paid for entirely by the company's drained reserves, Jen confirmed. This is where they've been spending their nights. It's not just a hideout, it's a monument to their arrogance. They thought they could operate in the dark forever, but the paper trail is blindingly obvious if you know where to look.
The anger I had suppressed for weeks finally crystallized into a cold, sharp blade. It wasn't enough that he had betrayed our marriage. He had built a second life on the foundation of the success I had helped him secure. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a common criminal.
"Can you package this?" I asked, my voice steady. "I need this in a format that a federal prosecutor would salivate over."
Jen closed the laptop and looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I can turn this into a report that will make the SEC open a file before the end of the day. But Claire, this is the point of no return. Once we hand this to the authorities, there's no walking it back. Brad will lose everything. The firm, the reputation, the penthouse, it will all be dismantled." "That's the goal," I said, standing up. I felt a profound sense of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't a victim of their deception. I was the architect of their downfall. He wanted to live a life built on lies. I'm just making sure the truth catches up with him. I took the drive back. The information was the ultimate weapon. We had everything: the motive, the method, and the smoking gun. The only thing left was to align the final piece of the strategy. It was time to reach out to Mark and prepare the final act of this play. The stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise. I met Mark in his boardroom at a private tower overlooking Central Park. It was the kind of office that radiated power, minimalist, glass-heavy, and completely detached from the mess of the street below. He wasn't the man I had met in the dark club weeks ago. Today, he was the majority shareholder of the firm Brad worked for. He had been playing the same long game as I had, just from the top down. "Everything is here," I said, sliding the encrypted drive across the mahogany table. Jen went through the accounts. It's not just bookkeeping errors. It's a systematic looting of the company. Insider trading, shell companies, and fraudulent tax filings. It's all documented. Mark didn't open the drive. He didn't have to. He tapped a finger against the table, his expression unreadable. I already suspected as much. That's why I needed you, Claire. I needed the inside track. Brad is arrogant, but he's not stupid. He's been careful to keep the paper trail away from the executive board. He thought he was untouchable because he was driving up the stock price through manipulation.
"He's not untouchable anymore," I replied.
"Correct." Mark stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. He thinks he's getting a promotion at the charity gala next week. He believes he's going to be named Executive VP. He's already inviting investors, press, and the board. He wants this to be the crowning moment of his career.
And that's exactly where we'll destroy it, I said.
The plan was surgical. We wouldn't just go to the police. We would go to the regulatory bodies with a package that was impossible to ignore. Mark had already coordinated with a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the FBI's white-collar crime division. They didn't want a long, drawn-out investigation. They wanted a slam-dunk case. The drive I handed him was the final piece of the puzzle. It connected the personal embezzlement directly to the corporate fraud.
We have the federal agents ready to move the moment the presentation starts, Mark explained, turning back to me. I've arranged for the video feed at the gala to be diverted. When he walks onto that stage, he won't be presenting his quarterly success. He'll be presenting the evidence of his own crimes to the entire room.
It was the ultimate form of irony. Brad loved the spotlight. He lived for the applause and the validation of his peers. We were going to give him the largest audience he had ever had, and we were going to use that stage to strip him of his dignity before the handcuffs went on.
What about Amber? I asked.
Mark's jaw tightened, just for a second. She's been his accomplice every step of the way. She's not just a girlfriend. She's an operative in this scheme. She goes down with him. I've already prepared the severance documentation to fire them both the second the authorities clear the room. They will have nothing. I felt no guilt. This wasn't revenge born of passion. It was a cleanup operation. They had used our lives, our finances, and our reputations as fuel for their own greed. Now it was time to close the account.
I have everything I need for the gala, I said, standing to leave. I'll be there, looking like the supportive wife, until the very last second. He won't see it coming.
That's the beauty of it, Mark noted, his voice cold and professional. He thinks you're still the woman he can control. He thinks your silence is your acceptance. He's going to be so busy basking in his own success that he won't see the trap until the screen lights up. I left the office with a clear head. The next few days would be the hardest, acting like everything was normal while knowing exactly how the world would end for them in a week. But I was ready. I had spent 60 days mastering the art of the lie. One more week was nothing. The gala wasn't just a party. It was the execution of a sentence, and I was the one who had written it. I walked into the elevator, the heavy steel doors closing with a final echoing thud. The countdown had officially begun. The annual corporate charity gala was an exercise in pure opulence. The ballroom at the Pierre Hotel was bathed in amber light, smelling of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. Men in tuxedos negotiated mergers over champagne, while women in designer gowns circulated like sharks in shallow water. It was the perfect stage for a destruction. I walked through the crowd, my posture perfect, my smile carefully neutral. I was wearing a simple dark dress, the color of a shadow. Brad was holding court near the stage, his hand firmly on Amber's waist. He looked every bit the rising executive, confident, polished, and entirely convinced that the world was his for the taking. He caught my eye and gestured for me to join him. I approached, maintaining the illusion of the supportive wife. "Claire," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing pride. "I'm glad you made it. Tonight is the night. Once I announce the new expansion strategy, the stock will soar. We're finally at the top." Amber smirked, her eyes scanning the room to see who was watching. "It's a big night, Claire. Try not to embarrass him." I didn't react. I just adjusted his lapel, smoothing out a wrinkle that wasn't there. "I wouldn't dream of it, Brad. I'm sure it's going to be a night no one here will forget." He took it as a compliment. He was so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't detect the steel in my voice. He checked his watch, smoothed his hair, and walked toward the stage.
The room quieted as he stepped up to the microphone, the spotlight catching the silver in his hair. He looked like a king claiming his throne.
Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice booming through the sound system. Tonight is about the future. It's about vision, growth, and the hard work that builds an empire. As he gestured for the technical team to cue the presentation, I looked toward the back of the room. Mark was standing in the shadows, his eyes locked on mine. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. The signal. The massive screens behind Brad flickered, then cut to black. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Brad frowned, turning around, waiting for the technical staff to fix the glitch. But there was no glitch. The screen surged to life, but it wasn't the slick corporate slide deck about market expansion. It was a high-resolution, time-stamped video of Brad and Amber in the secret penthouse, clearly discussing the siphoning of company funds. The audio was crystal clear, filling the silent ballroom with the sound of their casual greed. Brad stood paralyzed, the microphone still in his hand. Then, the screen shifted. It displayed the forensic audit, the shell companies, the insider trading logs, and the illicit wire transfers, all tied directly to his personal and corporate accounts. It was a digital map of his crimes, laid bare for every board member, investor, and reporter in the room to read. The room went deathly silent. The murmurs turned into gasps. I watched as the color drained from Brad's face, leaving him looking older, smaller. He turned to the crowd, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. He looked for support, but even Amber had stepped back, distancing herself from the wreckage.
Then, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. 2 federal agents in dark suits walked in, their movements efficient and unhurried. They didn't need to push through the crowd. The wall of people parted for them, sensing the gravity of the moment. They marched straight to the stage, the authority of the law radiating from them.
I stood at the edge of the room, watching the scene unfold with the detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. They reached the stage, and one of the agents produced a warrant. Brad didn't fight, he didn't yell. He stood there, limp, as they placed the handcuffs on his wrists. The contrast was striking. The man who had walked on stage to celebrate his power was now being led off in metal restraints, his reputation incinerated in less than 5 minutes. As they walked him past the crowd, the silence was broken by the quiet hum of cameras documenting his fall. He looked at me then, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and betrayal. He finally realized who had been pulling the strings. I didn't smile, and I didn't look away. I simply maintained eye contact until he was pushed out the doors and into the waiting transport.
The gala resumed, but the energy had shifted. The empire was gone, and with it, the life I had been forced to live. I turned, gathered my coat, and walked out of the ballroom. The night air was cool and crisp against my face. I hadn't just survived, I had prevailed. I took a deep breath, hailed a cab, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to look back. The long game was over, and I had won.